A quiet Canadian community, a family man selling his truck, and two strangers who turned a simple test drive into a chilling nightmare. This is not just a crime. It's a story of betrayal, brutality, and relentless pursuit of justice. Stay with us as we uncover the murder of Tim Bosma. On May 6, 2013, the suburban calm of Ancaster, a community within Hamilton, Ontario, was disturbed by a mystery that would grow darker with every passing day. At the center of it all was Tim Bosma, a man of 32 whose life revolved around simple values: family, faith, and hard work. He and his wife, Charlene, lived with their young daughter in a modest home, where Tim's easygoing personality and helpful nature made him well-liked in his neighborhood and respected among his friends. To those who knew him, Tim was dependable, the kind of person who was always willing to lend a hand. He was the last man anyone would expect to be pulled into a chain of violence that sounded more like fiction than reality. That spring, Tim listed his black Dodge Ram pickup truck for sale online. It was a routine decision, one countless people make when they want to upgrade or change vehicles. The posting was simple, straightforward, and ordinary. But on that night in early May, it drew the attention of two men whose intentions had nothing to do with purchasing a truck. They came to the Bosma residence posing as potential buyers, asking for a test drive. Tim, cautious but polite, agreed to go along with them. Charlene remembered him leaning in the doorway before leaving, telling her he wouldn't be gone long. He never returned. When Tim did not come home that night, Charlene's worry quickly escalated into alarm. Hours passed, and the silence of his absence grew heavy. She knew something was terribly wrong. By the next day, the police were notified, and a missing person investigation began. What followed was one of the largest and most emotionally charged searches in Ontario's recent history. Officers canvassed neighborhoods, scoured highways, and followed every tip that poured in from a community desperate to help. Volunteers joined in, posting flyers and spreading the word. Charlene herself stood before cameras, trembling but determined, making a heartfelt appeal for her husband's safe return. Her words carried the weight of desperation. Tim was a father, a husband, an ordinary man who had simply gone to show his truck. Behind this unfolding tragedy were two individuals whose paths had converged in a chilling partnership. Dylan Millard, the son of a wealthy aviation businessman, lived a life marked by contradictions. Outwardly, he was a man with resources, charm, and the privileges that came with money. But beneath the surface, he harbored a fascination with crime, power, and manipulation. He had inherited millions but seemed drawn more to destruction than creation. His family's company, Millard Air, was less an enterprise he nurtured and more a front for his darker ambitions. At his side was Mark Smitch, a 25-year-old from Oakville with a far different upbringing. Smitch was no heir but rather a high school dropout who drifted between petty crimes, drug use, and dreams of becoming a rapper. Friends described him as reckless and easily swayed, someone who lacked direction but sought belonging. In Millard, he found both an accomplice and a leader, a figure who offered him access to money, cars, and a sense of purpose, even if that purpose was criminal. Together, they formed a dangerous duo. Millard, the calculating mastermind with resources and chilling control, and Smitch, the eager participant willing to carry out violent acts for acceptance. Tim's disappearance was not random. Millard had orchestrated a plan to lure unsuspecting victims by responding to online ads for vehicles. Stealing cars was part of the thrill, but prosecutors later argued that Millard's motive went far deeper than theft. For him, the crime itself was the reward, the planning, the deception, and the domination over another person's fate. On the night they targeted Tim, Millard and Smitch arrived under the guise of buyers. They took the test drive, but somewhere during that ride, Tim's life was stolen from him. The details of his final moments would remain murky, but investigators later pieced together that he was shot and killed, his body disposed of with chilling calculation. For days, the Bosma family clung to hope. Police held press conferences, each time revealing just enough to keep the public engaged but not yet ready to disclose the horror they were uncovering. Behind the scenes, evidence was mounting. Surveillance footage, witness accounts, and forensic traces began to narrow the investigation toward Millard and Smitch. It became clear this was not simply a case of a man gone missing but something far darker. When investigators finally announced that Tim Bosma had been murdered, the community reeled in shock. The news was delivered with grim clarity. He had been killed the very night he disappeared, and his body was burned beyond recognition in an industrial animal incinerator owned by Millard. The device was hidden inside a barn on property he controlled, a location that became central to the case. It was a revelation that sent waves of grief through the Bosma family and ignited outrage across Canada. How could anyone take the life of a man so ordinary, so undeserving of harm, with such coldness? As the investigation deepened, the picture of the two killers became clearer. Millard was not just a man with resources but a manipulator who lived for the thrill of control. His history began to unravel in disturbing ways. Questions about the suspicious death of his father, Wayne Millard, and the disappearance of his former girlfriend, Laura Babcock, surfaced. To investigators, Tim's murder was part of a larger pattern of violence Millard had orchestrated, each crime a chilling escalation. Smitch's role, though secondary to Millard's, was no less significant. He was not merely a bystander, he was actively involved. Witnesses later recounted how he boasted about the killing in rap lyrics, turning tragedy into twisted self-promotion. In court, his demeanor reflected someone both aware of his guilt and desperate to shift blame, but his participation was undeniable. Back in Ancaster, Charlene Bosma was left to grapple with the unimaginable. Her appeals for Tim's safe return had ended with the cruel confirmation of his death. What followed was the beginning of a long and painful journey through trials, testimonies, and public scrutiny. Her quiet strength, though, became a beacon. She stood for Tim, for their daughter, and for the countless ordinary families who saw in the Bosmas a reflection of themselves. People living their lives, blindsided by senseless violence. Part 1 of the story ends not with closure but with heartbreak. Tim Bosma, a man who had done nothing more than put his truck up for sale, was gone. The community mourned, the family wept, and the nation recoiled at the revelation of how calculated and cruel human actions can be. The stage was set for a trial that would expose not just the details of the crime but the unsettling psychology of those who committed it. As the police investigation pressed forward, the focus shifted from the mystery of Tim Bosma's disappearance to the pursuit of justice for his brutal murder. The task was immense. Detectives were not only faced with unraveling the events of that night, but also with understanding the mindsets of the men who had taken an ordinary family's happiness and destroyed it with a single act of cruelty. The Bosma case quickly became one of the most closely followed criminal investigations in Canada, not just for its shocking nature but also for the way it exposed the calculated ruthlessness of the killers. From the beginning, investigators suspected that Tim had been targeted specifically through his online truck listing. Tracing the communications, police discovered that Dylan Millard had been using multiple phones and false identities, making it difficult to pin down his movements. Yet, technology became the thread that unraveled his web of lies. Cell phone records placed Millard and Mark Smitch in the vicinity of Tim's home the night he disappeared, and surveillance footage from surrounding neighborhoods showed glimpses of the vehicles connected to Millard. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, revealing a plan that had been in motion long before May 6th. The arrests of Millard and Smitch shocked the public in very different ways. Millard's name carried weight in Ontario because of his family's wealth. He was the heir to Millard Air, a once prominent aviation company, and was known among social circles as charismatic and well-connected. Yet beneath this veneer of charm, his private life was unraveling. His father, Wayne Millard, had died months earlier under suspicious circumstances, initially ruled a suicide but later reclassified as murder. His girlfriend, Laura Babcock, had disappeared in 2012, with growing evidence linking Millard to her death as well. Suddenly, the narrative of a privileged heir collapsed into the chilling reality of a man who appeared to be a serial killer. Smitch, on the other hand, was a drifter in life, moving between petty thefts, drug dealing, and half-serious attempts at music. Friends testified that he often bragged about crimes, though few had taken him seriously. After Tim's death, Smitch began crafting rap lyrics that referenced the murder in coded language. To investigators, this arrogance was a confirmation of his guilt. He was not just a follower of Millard. He reveled in the darkness of what they had done, though his insecurities made him dependent on Millard's leadership. The court proceedings began in 2016, 3 years after Tim's murder. For the Bosma family, those years were a painful wait filled with media coverage, rumors, and the haunting reality that their beloved husband and father was never coming back. Charlene Bosma remained at the heart of it all, carrying herself with dignity as she entered the courtroom. Her presence reminded everyone that behind the legal strategies and forensic evidence lay the very real consequences of violence. A daughter growing up without a father, a family shattered. The trial itself unfolded like a disturbing documentary. Prosecutors presented evidence of Millard's and Smitch's movements, their search histories, and the chilling discovery of the incinerator. It was not simply a case of theft gone wrong. It was a demonstration of premeditation. The fact that Millard had acquired an industrial incinerator months earlier painted a horrifying picture. He had been preparing for the disposal of bodies, making Tim's murder not an accident but an inevitability. Witnesses gave testimony that painted Millard as manipulative, controlling, and obsessed with proving himself untouchable. Former friends recalled his growing fascination with power and his dismissive attitude toward human life. He had a habit of boasting, showing off his wealth, and using people to achieve his goals. Smitch's acquaintances, meanwhile, spoke of a man who was unstable, with bursts of bravado but little direction, a follower eager to impress. The combination of Millard's resources and Smitch's recklessness proved deadly. The Bosma trial was emotionally charged. At times, Charlene had to listen to forensic details too horrific for any spouse to bear. The descriptions of Tim's remains, the methods used to erase him from existence, and the cavalier attitudes of the accused cut deeply. Yet she remained a symbol of quiet resilience, reminding everyone that the case was not just about two men in the dock, but about the life that had been stolen. Her words in the courtroom and to the media resonated across the country. Her family had been robbed of a future, and the cruelty of that loss could never be undone. Outside the courtroom, the story gripped Canada. News outlets covered every development, and the public followed with a mixture of horror and empathy. The idea that an innocent man could be lured from his home, killed, and disposed of so methodically struck a chord with families everywhere. It wasn't just the Bosmas who were shaken. It was every household that had ever posted something online, every person who believed they were safe in their own neighborhood. As evidence mounted, the defense struggled to construct a narrative that might absolve their clients of the harshest charges. Millard's lawyers attempted to portray him as less directly involved in the actual act of killing, while Smitch's team suggested he was under Millard's influence, a young man manipulated into following orders. Yet the jury saw through these attempts. The overwhelming evidence pointed to both men as willing participants. The brutality of the crime, the preparation of the incinerator, and the subsequent boasting eliminated any possibility of misunderstanding. The turning point came when jurors were shown how deliberate the crime had been. From the choice of Tim's truck, to the timing of the test drive, to the disposal of his body, every detail underscored the planning involved. This was not an impulsive theft. It was a premeditated murder, carried out with chilling efficiency. For the Bosma family, each day in court was another reminder of the horror they had lived through. Charlene's testimony, in particular, stood as a poignant moment. She spoke of the night Tim left, the hope she had clung to during the search, and the devastation that followed the discovery of his fate. Her voice carried the weight of grief, but also strength. She wanted the jury to see Tim not just as a victim in a case file but as a real man whose life mattered. The trial also revealed just how far Millard's darkness extended. Prosecutors introduced evidence connecting him to other crimes, including the disappearance of Laura Babcock and the suspicious death of his father. Though these were separate cases, they painted a portrait of a man who had grown increasingly bold, treating human life as disposable. By the time he targeted Tim, Millard had already shown he was capable of killing. Smitch's role as a willing partner cemented the duo's place in Canadian criminal history. As the second part of the story closed, the jury's task loomed large. They had to weigh weeks of testimony, sift through evidence, and decide the fate of two men whose actions had left a family broken and a community haunted. But the narrative was becoming undeniable. Tim Bosma had been murdered with deliberation, his body desecrated, his life stolen in an act of calculated cruelty. The trial was inching toward its conclusion, but for the Bosmas, no verdict could undo what had been done. The courtroom waited in tense silence as the jury prepared to deliver its verdict. For 3 years, the Bosma family had endured uncertainty, grief, and an agonizing search for truth. For weeks, they had listened to evidence detailing the callous brutality of Tim's murder, forced to relive the darkest night of their lives again and again. And now the final step was at hand. When the foreperson of the jury finally announced that both Dellen Millard and Mark Smich were guilty of first-degree murder, the words reverberated like a thunderclap. For the Bosmas, it was not victory, it could never be, but it was justice. The sentence was automatic: life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Millard and Smich showed little emotion as the verdict was read. Millard remained cold and expressionless, the same calculated demeanor he had maintained throughout the trial. Smich shifted uncomfortably, his head lowered, but the lack of visible remorse from either man was striking. For Charlene Bosma, who sat listening with quiet strength, it was the end of one chapter, but not the end of her grief. She left the courtroom with the same dignity she had shown since the beginning, her husband's memory carried with her, her voice becoming the voice of countless victims' families across the country. The trial had done more than convict two killers. It had peeled back the layers of Millard's double life and exposed him as something far more dangerous than a privileged heir gone astray. In the months and years following the Bosma verdict, prosecutors pursued additional charges against him. He was eventually convicted of murdering Laura Babcock, his former girlfriend who had vanished in 2012, and his father, Wayne Millard, whose death had initially been treated as a suicide. With each conviction, the portrait of Dellen Millard grew darker. A manipulative, calculating man who saw life as expendable and sought dominance through destruction. He would serve consecutive life sentences, effectively ensuring he would never walk free again. For Mark Smich, the verdict sealed his fate as well. Though not the mastermind, he had been a willing partner, his loyalty to Millard tethered to a need for validation and belonging. His involvement in Tim Bosma's murder left him branded not just as a criminal, but as a man who had embraced violence without hesitation. His youthful bravado, his rap lyrics glorifying crime, and his shallow attempts to minimize his role in the killing could not shield him from accountability. He, too, would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his dreams of infamy realized in the darkest way possible. For the Bosma family, the conclusion of the trial did not bring closure, it never could. Tim was gone, his presence now only in photographs, memories, and the stories his wife would tell their daughter as she grew up. Charlene faced the future with courage, knowing that her child would never know her father beyond those memories. Yet she also understood that Tim's story had become larger than their family. It was a story that resonated with a nation, a reminder of how quickly the ordinary could be torn apart by senseless violence. The community of Ancaster, and indeed much of Canada, rallied around the Bosmas. Vigils were held, flowers laid, and fundraisers organized to support the family. Strangers wept at the tragedy of a man whose only mistake was trusting enough to accompany two strangers on a short drive. The case became symbolic of the fragility of safety, the vulnerability of ordinary people in the face of calculated evil. Families across the country began to look differently at the simple act of selling a car online or opening their door to strangers. The crime reshaped not just one family's life but the way a society perceived trust in the digital age. Charlene's words after the verdict captured both the sorrow and resilience of her journey. She spoke of the hole left in their lives, the milestones her husband would never witness, the birthdays, anniversaries, the moments of laughter that make up a family's story. But she also spoke of gratitude to the community that had surrounded them, the officers who had pursued justice relentlessly, and the friends and strangers alike who had carried them through the darkest of days. Her strength became a beacon, not just for those mourning Tim but for other families who had suffered senseless loss. The Bosma case also forced a broader reflection on the nature of evil. Millard's wealth and privilege had not shielded him from becoming a predator. If anything, His resources had enabled him to plan and conceal his crimes more effectively. His case raised questions about how someone with every opportunity for success could instead choose destruction. Smitch, though from a different background, revealed how vulnerability and recklessness could merge into complicity in horror. Together, they embodied two sides of the same coin, one with money and power, the other with desperation and bravado, united in their willingness to end a man's life for reasons still difficult to comprehend. In the years following the convictions, the Bosma name remained in the headlines, often connected to new revelations about Millard's other crimes. Each time, the pain was reopened, but it also reinforced the importance of Tim's story being remembered. He was not simply a victim of a random act. His murder was the result of deliberate planning, a chilling reminder that evil can wear many faces, even those that appear ordinary. For Canadians, the case became a marker in true crime history, a story studied and retold not only for its brutality but for the human strength that rose from it. The legacy of the case lies not in Millard or Smitch, but in the resilience of those left behind. Charlene Bosma, by continuing to speak publicly, ensured that Tim's life was not reduced to a crime statistic. She reminded the country that behind every headline was a human being, loved and missed, whose absence left ripples through countless lives. In that sense, Tim's story became about more than tragedy. It became about the enduring power of love, family, and the pursuit of justice. As the final chapter of this story closes, the image that lingers is not of courtrooms or verdicts but of a family's life interrupted. Tim Bosma was a man who valued simplicity, whose greatest joy was in being a husband and father. His murder shocked a nation, but his memory continues to stand as a symbol of resilience against cruelty. The men who killed him will live out their lives in prison, their names remembered for darkness. But Tim's name endures as a reminder of light extinguished too soon, and of the love that survives even the most unimaginable loss. On the quiet shores of Long Island, beneath the sand and silence, police uncovered a mystery that terrified a nation. For over a decade, a serial predator hid in plain sight, until one shocking arrest exposed the darkness behind a suburban life. This is the story you cannot look away from. For years, the whispers about a hidden predator haunted the shoreline of Long Island. The discovery of bodies scattered along the isolated stretch of Ocean Parkway between 2010 and 2011 shook not only Suffolk County but the entire nation. What emerged was not just a story of murder but a reflection of how vulnerable lives, often overlooked by society, became prey to a killer who knew how to exploit secrecy and shadows. This mystery became one of America's most infamous unsolved cases until the quiet suburban life of an unassuming architect unraveled under the weight of evidence, pulling him into the light as the man suspected of being the Long Island serial killer. The story begins in December 2010, when police were searching for Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old sex worker who vanished after a frantic 911 call. She had been running through the marshlands near Oak Beach, terrified, pleading for help. Although Shannon's disappearance led officers to comb the surrounding area, what they discovered was far more shocking. Instead of finding her, investigators unearthed the remains of 4 other women, all wrapped in burlap, positioned within a short distance of one another near Gilgo Beach. These women would later be identified as Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes, the victims who became collectively known as the Gilgo Four. Their discovery would transform a missing persons search into a homicide investigation of staggering proportions. The investigation painted a grim picture. The victims were petite women in their 20s, all of them connected through sex work advertised online. Their sudden vanishings had not triggered the level of urgency that might have accompanied other cases, a reality that exposed societal biases about the lives of sex workers. Families of the women spoke out against the dismissive attitudes they encountered, demanding that authorities see their daughters, sisters, and mothers as more than just their profession. Their grief was mixed with anger, as they sought not only justice but also dignity for the women whose lives had been brutally cut short. Among them was Melissa Barthelemy, a 24-year-old who vanished in July 2009. Her case became especially disturbing when her teenage sister began receiving a series of cruel and taunting phone calls from Melissa's own cell phone. The caller mocked the family's grief, boasting about Melissa's fate. The voice on the line was calm, cold, and deliberate, leaving detectives convinced it was the killer himself. For Melissa's family, each ring of the phone deepened the torment, forcing them to listen helplessly to the monster behind her disappearance. Megan Waterman, just 22 years old, disappeared in June 2010 after leaving a hotel in Hauppauge. She was a young mother trying to raise her daughter while navigating financial struggles. Her disappearance left her family reeling, especially her child, who grew up without a mother. Megan's case struck a chord because it underscored the vulnerability of young women drawn into dangerous situations while trying to survive. Amber Costello's story was one of a kind-hearted woman whose life had been eroded by addiction. At 27, she was last seen leaving her home in September 2010. Neighbors described her as generous and caring, someone who loved animals, yet also someone battling her demons. Her disappearance left behind friends and family who felt her absence like an open wound, compounded by the knowledge that her struggles had left her exposed to predation. The earliest of the known victims was Maureen Brainerd Barnes, a 25-year-old from Connecticut who vanished in 2007. She was the devoted mother of 2 children, determined to provide for them despite limited opportunities. Her decision to meet clients through online ads placed her in the crosshairs of danger, and when her remains were finally discovered in 2011, her family's years of unanswered questions turned into the devastating confirmation they had always feared. The similarities among the victims convinced investigators that a single perpetrator was responsible. The careful disposal of the bodies, the method of communication, and the chosen victims all suggested an organized predator who understood how to conceal his crimes. Despite mounting pressure, the investigation soon grew cold. Public frustration simmered as years passed without an arrest. Families accused law enforcement of dragging their feet, while the community wondered whether the killer was still out there, living among them in plain sight. What the public didn't know was that investigators were slowly piecing together a puzzle that stretched across years of phone records, internet searches, and forensic evidence. The killer, whoever he was, had used burner phones to arrange meetings with victims, leaving behind only fragments of digital trails. Yet, in those fragments lay the key to unmasking him. Detectives examined tower data, matched times and locations, and began narrowing down possible suspects. The breakthrough, however, would not come until more than a decade after the first discoveries. In 2022, a renewed push to solve the Gilgo Beach murders began under the direction of a newly formed task force that included local police, state investigators, and the FBI. Advances in technology gave them tools that had not been available a decade earlier. Cell phone analysis became sharper, and DNA testing more precise. Investigators revisited evidence with fresh eyes and new techniques, determined not to let the case remain unsolved. The task force zeroed in on a man who, to neighbors and colleagues, seemed unremarkable. His name was Rex Hoyerman, a 59-year-old architect who lived in Massapequa Park. He commuted to Manhattan for work, blending into the daily rhythms of city life. Married with children, he appeared to be just another suburban husband, his home sitting quietly among others on a tree-lined street. Yet behind this facade was a man leading a double life, one that investigators would soon uncover in chilling detail. Surveillance and forensic work tied Hoyerman to the crimes. He had used burner phones to contact victims, but the patterns in his communications and the locations of cell towers connected to his calls began to form a map that pointed to him. More damning was DNA evidence, traced back to discarded pizza crust investigators had collected. A simple piece of food waste carried the genetic markers that matched material recovered from one of the victims, tightening the noose around him. When news broke of his arrest in July 2023, it stunned not only the community of Massapequa Park, but the entire nation. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the man they knew, a quiet architect, often seen mowing his lawn or exchanging casual greetings, with the monster he was accused of being. Reporters swarmed the street, capturing images of the modest home that had shielded the alleged killer for years. Inside his own household, the impact was devastating. His wife, Asa Ellerup, and their children were reportedly blindsided. Investigators later revealed that the murders took place during periods when Asa was out of town, suggesting meticulous planning on Hoyerman's part to maintain the illusion of normal family life. Asa filed for divorce soon after his arrest, her world shattered by the possibility that the man she had lived beside for decades had harbored such darkness. The arrest did not end the mystery but marked a pivotal turning point in a story that had haunted Long Island for over a decade. Families of the victims expressed both relief and sorrow, relieved that someone had finally been held accountable, yet sorrowful that their loved ones were not coming back. For the community, the arrest raised unsettling questions about how a man could conceal such horrors while living an apparently ordinary life. As the case moved forward, prosecutors charged Hoyerman with the murders of 3 women, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, while naming him the prime suspect in the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Collectively, they were the Gilgo Four, the names etched into the public consciousness as the victims whose discovery first pulled back the veil on the Long Island serial killer. But even as these charges moved through the courts, the possibility remained that Hoyerman's alleged crimes extended beyond them, that other victims buried along the shores of Long Island might also be tied to him. The story of the Long Island serial killer had entered a new chapter. No longer only about unidentified remains or unanswered questions, it had shifted to the examination of a man accused of hiding his crimes in plain sight. For investigators, journalists, and grieving families, the search for truth was far from over. The question now was not only what Rex Hoyerman had done, but how long he had been doing it, and whether more names, more faces, and more families would be added to the grim ledger of the Gilgo Beach murders. The arrest of Rex Hoyerman did not bring the story to a close. In fact, it opened up more layers of darkness and intrigue than anyone could have anticipated. As investigators combed through his life, his possessions, and his digital footprint, the portrait of a man who had managed to live 2 entirely separate lives began to take shape. On one side stood the image of a husband, father, and architect, someone neighbors described as awkward but harmless, a man who kept to himself yet never raised suspicion. On the other side emerged the man prosecutors alleged was a cold-blooded killer, who meticulously planned encounters with vulnerable women and carefully concealed evidence to elude law enforcement for more than a decade. In the wake of his arrest, Suffolk County Police executed a sweeping search of his home, tearing apart the walls, floors, and storage spaces, determined to find any link to the victims. The quiet suburban house quickly became the center of a media frenzy. Helicopters circling overhead, journalists swarming the block, and neighbors watching in stunned disbelief. Inside, investigators cataloged thousands of pieces of evidence, from firearms to electronic devices, each item scrutinized for clues. They hoped that somewhere within the cluttered rooms of Hoyerman's home, there might be answers, links to the women whose lives had been taken, or signs that others may have been harmed. The community of Massapequa Park was left unsettled. Parents who had once allowed their children to ride bikes freely now looked at every passing car with unease. People who had lived next door to Hoyerman for decades wondered how they had missed the signs, how a man accused of such horrors could have blended so seamlessly into suburban life. Some neighbors recalled him as gruff and socially awkward, often seeming uncomfortable in conversation. Others remembered his imposing physical presence, tall, broad-shouldered, intimidating. Yet they never connected him to the whispers of a killer who had haunted Long Island for years. The families of the victims, meanwhile, were thrust back into the spotlight. They had fought for years to keep their loved ones' cases from fading into obscurity, and now they watched as the man accused of their murders stood in a courtroom, shackled and silent. For Melissa Barthelemy's family, the arrest stirred memories of the taunting phone calls that had tormented them after her disappearance. The thought that the man on the other end of the line might finally have a name and face brought a bittersweet sense of relief. Megan Waterman's family, especially her daughter who had grown up without a mother, saw in the arrest a chance for justice, even as the loss remained immeasurable. For Amber Costello's loved ones, the charges confirmed the fears they had harbored for years, that her kindness had been exploited by someone who viewed her as disposable. And for the family of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, the announcement reopened the wound of her long absence, but also offered the possibility of closure after more than a decade of unanswered questions. The investigation into Hoyerman's background revealed disturbing details. His online activity was filled with searches about sex workers, torture, and the Gilgo Beach case itself. Investigators noted his obsession with following media coverage of the murders, as though he sought to monitor how much police knew and whether they were closing in on him. This fixation was a chilling reminder of how killers often insert themselves into the narrative, tracking their own notoriety while hiding behind a mask of normalcy. Even his professional life contained strange contradictions. Colleagues described him as meticulous and detail-oriented, qualities that prosecutors believed mirrored the careful planning of his alleged crimes. Yet his personal interactions were often described as unsettling, leaving some to wonder how they had dismissed the oddities they noticed over the years. At the same time, the arrest cast a long shadow over his family. His wife, Asa Ellerup, who had filed for divorce within days of his arrest, became an unwilling participant in the unfolding story. She insisted she had no knowledge of his alleged crimes, and investigators supported that conclusion by noting that Hoyerman committed the murders during times when she was out of town. Still, the stigma was unavoidable. Her quiet life had been upended overnight. Cameras lined her street, reporters shouted questions, and strangers speculated about her private world. Her children, too, faced a harsh reality. Their father was accused of being a serial killer. The home they had grown up in was now treated as a crime scene, and their family name was plastered across headlines around the world. Court proceedings began to reveal the depth of the evidence against Hoyerman. Prosecutors outlined how his use of burner phones matched the timeline of the victims' disappearances, how cell tower data placed him near the locations where the women vanished, and how his DNA, traced from a discarded pizza crust, matched genetic material recovered from a victim's remains. The strategy was clear: to show that Hoyerman had not only the means and opportunity but also the chilling patience to conceal his crimes for more than a decade. Defense attorneys, in turn, painted him as a family man, a hard-working architect caught in a web of circumstantial evidence. The clash between these narratives would form the basis of a trial that promised to captivate the nation. Meanwhile, the media dove deeper into every aspect of his life, producing documentaries, articles, and interviews with anyone who had crossed paths with him. Old classmates recalled a boy who was bullied, awkward, and withdrawn. Former co-workers spoke of his strict, almost rigid approach to projects. Some accounts painted him as eccentric rather than dangerous, but with the benefit of hindsight, many began to question whether the oddities they had once overlooked were signs of something darker. The duality of Hoyerman, the ordinary man and the accused killer, became a focal point of public fascination. For law enforcement, the work was far from over. The arrest had answered some questions but raised many others. Were there additional victims? Could Hoyerman be connected to the other sets of remains found along Ocean Parkway, cases that did not fit the exact pattern of the Gilgo Four? Investigators revisited these files, examining whether his methods aligned or diverged. They also explored his potential movements outside Long Island, investigating whether similar disappearances elsewhere might be linked to him. The scope of their work expanded as they sought to determine whether the Gilgo Beach murders were only a fraction of a larger, more disturbing pattern. As this process unfolded, the families of victims not officially tied to Hoyerman waited anxiously. For them, the possibility of answers remained out of reach, their loved ones still trapped in limbo between mystery and closure. Their voices joined those of the Gilgo Force families in calling for a thorough investigation, urging authorities not to overlook anyone whose remains had been found along that desolate stretch of coastline. The psychological weight of the case grew heavier with each revelation. The idea that someone could conceal such acts within a seemingly ordinary life forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil. Serial killers were often imagined as shadowy figures, obvious monsters lurking in the margins. But the arrest of Rex Hoyerman suggested something more chilling: that evil could live next door, dressed in the clothes of normalcy, hidden behind the routines of everyday life. By the time the first hearings concluded, the story had evolved into one of the most significant true crime cases of the decade. It was no longer only about the women whose remains had been found near Gilgo Beach, though they remained at its heart. It was also about the failures and persistence of law enforcement, the resilience of grieving families, and the disturbing capacity of an ordinary man to allegedly commit extraordinary cruelty. The world watched as the narrative unfolded, waiting to see whether justice would finally emerge from the marshlands of Long Island. The story of the Long Island serial killer entered its final phase not with the sudden revelation of guilt or innocence, but with the slow, grinding machinery of the justice system. Rex Hoyerman, the man accused of being the predator who haunted Gilgo Beach, was now a figure seated in a courtroom, his large frame filling the space, his eyes often hidden behind glasses as prosecutors laid out the evidence against him. The atmosphere was tense, the families of victims seated only feet away, watching the man they believed had destroyed their lives. Every hearing was not only a step toward trial, but also an emotional reckoning for the community that had lived under the shadow of an unsolved mystery for over a decade. The evidence presented painted a chilling picture of a man who, if guilty, had lived an astonishing double life. Prosecutors emphasized the burner phones used to lure victims, the call records that aligned with the women's last moments of freedom, and the cell tower data that placed Hoyerman in crucial locations at crucial times. The discarded pizza crust, which led to a DNA match, was presented as the scientific linchpin tying him to the crimes. Alongside this evidence were chilling details from his internet searches, revealing a man fascinated by the very case he was accused of perpetrating, someone who monitored media coverage of the Gilgo Beach murders as if studying his own reflection. For the families, listening to this evidence was an ordeal. Every piece of information, every photograph shown, every mention of remains found along the shoreline was a fresh wound. Yet they bore it with determination, insisting that their loved ones deserved nothing less than the full truth. Some family members spoke to the press after hearings, expressing gratitude that justice seemed closer, while also voicing their anguish that the trial process prolonged their grief. The media spotlight, which once shone only on their daughters in the context of their profession as sex workers, now illuminated the systemic failures that had allowed their cases to remain cold for so long. In that exposure, the families found both pain and vindication. Hoyerman's defense team pursued its own strategy, portraying him as an easy target for investigators desperate to close a case that had embarrassed law enforcement for years. They questioned the strength of the DNA evidence, challenged the reliability of cell tower data, and argued that much of the case was built on circumstantial connections rather than direct proof. They described him as a husband and father, a man who spent his days designing office buildings and suburban spaces, not hunting women in the night. To some observers, the defense raised legitimate questions. To others, it was an attempt to humanize the inhuman. As the trial loomed, the community of Long Island found itself revisiting the fear that had first erupted when the bodies were discovered. Residents along Ocean Parkway spoke of the unease that had never fully left. The way the wind across the marshes seemed to carry echoes of unanswered questions. Could one man truly be responsible for all the bodies found in the area? Or were there multiple killers, their crimes converging in the same lonely stretch of coastline? Investigators themselves acknowledged that not all of the cases matched the Gilgo Four in detail. Some victims were older, some were men, and others had disappeared under different circumstances. The possibility of more than one predator operating in the shadows remained a terrifying prospect. Beyond the borders of Long Island, the case had become a national and even global story. True crime enthusiasts, journalists, and criminologists analyzed every development. Documentaries dissected the timeline, podcasts speculated on motives, and online forums buzzed with theories. The fascination was not just with the crimes but with the idea that someone like Rex Hoyerman could have lived unnoticed for so long. His life became a subject of public dissection. His childhood, his career, his relationships, all examined for signs of the darkness that prosecutors claimed lurked within him. Inside his own family, the fallout was catastrophic. His wife Asa, after filing for divorce, kept a low profile, navigating the unwanted attention of the press while trying to rebuild her life. For her, every headline was a reminder that the man she had trusted for years was accused of atrocities beyond comprehension. Her children bore a different burden. their identities forever linked to the alleged crimes of their father. They had not chosen this legacy, yet they were forced to carry it, an invisible weight pressing down with each new revelation. Their trauma became a silent parallel to the trauma of the victims' families, another example of how violence ripples outward far beyond the initial act. The courtroom proceedings also reignited debates about law enforcement's handling of the case. Critics pointed to the years of delay, the disorganization, and the apparent disinterest in cases involving sex workers. Advocates for marginalized women argued that if the victims had come from different backgrounds, the killer might have been caught sooner. This criticism became part of the larger narrative, that justice delayed is justice denied, and that the system itself must change if similar tragedies are to be prevented. As the case moved closer to a full trial, the portrait of Rex Heuermann grew more complex. Some described him as an awkward loner who struggled with social interactions, while others recalled a man capable of holding conversations about architecture and community life. This duality, ordinary man and alleged predator, remained at the center of the story. The question of motive lingered as well. Why would a successful architect with a family risk everything to commit such crimes? Was it compulsion, control, or something even darker? Prosecutors did not need to prove motive, but the question gnawed at the public, who sought meaning in the senseless. The Long Island serial killer case, even with an arrest and charges, was never just about one man. It was about the victims whose lives were cut short, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams. It was about the families who refused to let them be forgotten, who turned grief into relentless advocacy. It was about a community forced to confront the reality that evil had walked among them, hidden behind suburban lawns and office suits. And it was about the justice system, grappling with its own failures and striving to deliver accountability at last. By the time the final arguments were prepared, one truth had become clear. No verdict, no sentence, could undo the damage done. If Rex Heuermann was found guilty, the families would have the comfort of knowing the man responsible was behind bars, but their loved ones would not return. If he was somehow acquitted, the terror of uncertainty would remain. The case, in many ways, was less about resolution than about the pursuit of truth, however incomplete that truth might be. The marshlands of Gilgo Beach, once a place of leisure and escape, had become a symbol of horror and mystery. Each gust of wind over the dunes, each tide rolling in from the Atlantic, seemed to carry whispers of the past, of the women whose lives had ended there, and of the questions that still lingered. For the families, for the community, and for all who followed the case, the story of the Long Island serial killer was not only about one man's alleged crimes but about the enduring human need for justice, closure, and understanding in the face of unspeakable loss. And so the saga continues, not as a closed chapter but as a living, breathing case, one that will be studied, remembered, and debated for years to come. The trial of Rex Heuermann may decide his fate, but the legacy of the Gilgo Beach murders will remain etched in the collective memory of Long Island and far beyond. The shadow cast by those desolate dunes cannot easily be lifted. It lingers, a reminder of lives stolen, of questions unanswered, and of the thin line that separates the ordinary from the monstrous. On a snowy December night in 2010, a young woman vanished in Bristol, sparking one of the UK's most gripping murder cases. What began as a missing persons search soon spiraled into a chilling tale of deception, obsession, and wrongful suspicion. This is the story of Joanna Yates. On the evening of December 17, 2010, the city of Bristol was dressed in its usual December chill. It was the kind of night when streets glistened with frost, Christmas lights shimmered in windows, and the air carried both the excitement of the festive season and the stillness of winter. In the lively district of Clifton, a young woman named Joanna Claire Yates was preparing for what seemed like an ordinary night out with her colleagues. At just 25 years old, Joanna was building a life many would envy. A promising career as a landscape architect, a loving relationship with her boyfriend Greg Reardon, and a circle of friends who described her as warm, intelligent, and full of life. That Friday evening, Joanna joined her co-workers for drinks at a local pub. She laughed, she chatted, and she carried herself with the ease of someone content. She wasn't known for late nights, and around 8 o'clock, She left the group and made her way home. On her route, she stopped at a supermarket, picking up a pizza. CCTV cameras caught her final moments in public, and the footage would later become a haunting reminder of a life cut short. At that time, no one had reason to believe that this ordinary purchase would be the last image the world would see of her alive. Joanna lived in a ground-floor flat on Canninge Road in Clifton, one of Bristol's affluent areas. The flat was a shared home with her boyfriend, Greg Reardon, a fellow architect with whom she had been in a steady relationship. On that night, Greg was away visiting his family in Sheffield. Joanna returned home alone. Nothing about that detail seemed unusual. Their lives were filled with trust and routine. The following morning passed without alarm, but as the hours stretched into days, the quiet absence of Joanna became undeniable. When Greg returned to Bristol on Sunday, December 19th, he walked into their flat expecting to be greeted by Joanna's presence. Instead, what he found unsettled him immediately. Her coat was draped neatly inside, her handbag rested where it normally would, and her glasses were in their usual place. All signs indicated that Joanna had returned home after her evening out. But there was no sign of her. More curiously, the pizza she had purchased was missing, a small detail that nagged at Greg but didn't yet explain her absence. Greg tried calling her phone. He tried retracing her steps in his mind. Friends had not heard from her either. Within hours, Greg's worry escalated into fear. He contacted the police, and soon Joanna was officially declared a missing person. What began as a local inquiry quickly spiraled into one of the largest investigations Avon and Somerset police had undertaken. The disappearance of a young, promising woman in the middle of a vibrant city triggered both community concern and national media attention. Posters bearing Joanna's smiling face spread across Bristol. News broadcasts carried her story, showing the CCTV footage of her final known moments. Friends and family appealed for her safe return, clinging to hope that she might still be alive. The public was urged to check gardens, garages, and sheds, as police scoured the area for any clue. It was Christmas season, and instead of celebration, a wave of unease spread through the city. The Yates family, devastated and desperate, traveled to Bristol. Her parents, David and Teresa Yates, became the public face of the family's plea. In press conferences, they spoke of their daughter with a mix of pride and heartbreak. David described her as a beautiful, bright, and caring young woman whose future had only just begun. Their anguish resonated with the nation, and the case soon gripped headlines across the UK. But behind the appeals and searches, investigators were struggling. Days passed without a breakthrough. Joanna's phone remained switched off, and no activity was detected on her bank accounts. Each passing day chipped away at the likelihood of a happy ending. Theories grew. Had she been abducted by a stranger? Had she left of her own accord? Or was someone closer to her involved? The first significant development came on Christmas morning, when the discovery no one wanted became reality. A couple walking their dog along Longwood Lane near Fale and, just a few miles outside of Bristol, came across a body lying on a snow-covered verge. The body was soon confirmed to be Joanna Yates. She had been strangled, her life brutally taken. The missing persons case transformed instantly into a murder investigation. Shockwaves rippled through the community. The image of Joanna's smiling face, once a beacon of hope for her safe return, now symbolized a life stolen. The festive period turned grim. Her parents, shattered by the discovery, faced the unbearable reality that their daughter would never return. Greg, whose every action had been to help find her, was now left in a devastating silence, his world upended. Detectives faced immense pressure. The brutality of the crime, combined with the intense media coverage, demanded results. The police began to narrow their focus, starting with those closest to Joanna. In many cases, statistics pointed toward partners or family members, but Greg was quickly ruled out. His alibi was solid, and his cooperation with the investigation was absolute. Attention then turned to others within Joanna's immediate circle, including her landlord, Christopher Jeffries, a retired schoolteacher who lived in the same building. Jeffries was eccentric, intelligent, and somewhat unconventional in manner. Neighbors described him as odd, with unusual habits. In the eyes of detectives and the media, this eccentricity became suspicion. On December 30th, Jeffries was arrested on suspicion of murder. The media pounced, painting him as a strange and possibly sinister figure. His image appeared on front pages, with speculation about his character replacing any presumption of innocence. But behind the media frenzy, evidence linking Jeffries to the crime was thin. He was eventually released without charge, though the damage to his reputation was profound. As the new year began, the investigation reached a critical point. The arrest of Jeffries had proven premature, leaving the public uneasy and the police under scrutiny. The killer remained at large, and the unanswered question loomed. Who had murdered Joanna Yates, and why? Unbeknown to investigators at the time, the man responsible lived just a wall away from Joanna. He was not a stranger lurking in the shadows, but her next-door neighbor, a Dutch engineer named Vincent Tabak. Intelligent, socially awkward, and leading a quiet existence with his girlfriend, Tabak blended into the neighborhood without raising suspicion. While the nation focused on Jeffries, Tabak continued his life, concealing a dark secret that would eventually surface in the months to follow. The tragedy of Joanna Yates had now shifted from the hopeful search for a missing woman to the grim pursuit of justice for a murder victim. The story was only beginning to unfold, and with every revelation, it would expose not only the chilling reality of Joanna's final moments, but also the broader failures and consequences of rushing to judgment. The new year began with the city of Bristol still reeling from the brutal revelation of Joanna Yates' murder. The media coverage remained relentless, and the public, desperate for answers, demanded justice. Police investigators were under extraordinary pressure. Their initial arrest of Christopher Jeffries, Joanna's eccentric landlord, had seemed promising to many observers, but with his release without charge, suspicion fell back into uncertainty. The arrest had not only failed to bring resolution but had also ignited a storm of controversy about media responsibility. Newspapers had rushed to vilify Jeffries, branding him guilty in the court of public opinion long before the law had its say. He would later fight back and win his name in court, but at that moment, his life had been turned upside down for something he had not done. For the investigators, clearing Jeffries forced them to step back and re-examine the evidence. They needed to approach the case with sharper focus, sifting through every clue again. The CCTV footage showing Joanna buying the pizza, the absence of that pizza from her flat, the signs that she had made it home. All of it formed a puzzle that had yet to be solved. Detectives combed through phone records, forensics, and witness statements. It was a painstaking process, but within that evidence lay the key to unraveling the truth. Attention gradually shifted toward other residents in the same building. Among them was a man who had, up to that point, escaped the glare of suspicion. Vincent Tabak, a 32-year-old Dutch engineer. On the surface, Tabak seemed unremarkable. He lived with his girlfriend, Tanya Morrison, in the flat next door to Joanna's. Colleagues knew him as intelligent and professional, though somewhat withdrawn in nature. He did not fit the typical profile of a violent offender, at least not outwardly. But as police dug deeper, small cracks began to emerge in his facade. Tabak had been cooperative when questioned, but his behavior struck some investigators as oddly rehearsed. His version of events was flat, his emotions subdued. A search of his phone and computer data uncovered troubling material. He had a history of browsing violent pornography, often involving themes of strangulation and coercion. Though not direct proof of murder, the findings painted a disturbing picture of his inner world. Further, his phone records placed him in locations that contradicted parts of his alibi. The net around Tabak began to tighten. Forensic evidence, too, began to link him to Joanna. Fibers and DNA traces provided compelling indications of his presence at critical moments. It was enough to convince police to take decisive action. In late January 2011, Tabak was arrested. At first, he denied involvement, but as questioning intensified, he admitted he had been with Joanna on the night of her death. His story, however, was far from straightforward. He insisted that her death had been an accident. According to Tabak, he had gone next door, they had a brief interaction, and during that moment he claimed, things had escalated unexpectedly. He strangled her, he said, but not with the intention to kill. His version of events attempted to reframe the crime as a tragic mistake rather than deliberate murder. Investigators, however, were not convinced. Strangulation is a sustained and intimate form of killing, one that cannot easily be brushed aside as accidental. The evidence showed that Joanna had struggled. The very act demanded force, time, and intent. Tabak's explanation seemed designed to lessen the weight of his guilt, but to detectives, it rang hollow. His actions after the killing told an even clearer story. Instead of seeking help or showing remorse, he had transported Joanna's body in his car, driving it out of Bristol and leaving it by the roadside in Phelan. It was a calculated act of concealment, not panic. Meanwhile, Tanya Morrison, Tabak's girlfriend, found her life turned upside down. To her, he had been a partner, a man she trusted and shared a home with. Now, she faced the horrifying realization that he had been living a double life. Though she was not implicated in his crime, the discovery of his guilt shattered her world. Friends and family who had known the couple struggled to reconcile the mild-mannered Vincent they thought they knew with the murderer the evidence revealed. The case finally reached the courtroom in October 2011. It was one of the most closely followed trials in recent memory, watched by the nation with a mix of fascination and dread. The prosecution laid out its argument clearly. Vincent Tabak had not killed Joanna in a sudden accident, but in a sexually motivated attack. They pointed to his obsession with violent pornography, his history of searching for terms related to strangulation, and the cold, methodical way he disposed of Joanna's body. His actions, they argued, were not those of a man shocked by an accident but of someone determined to hide his crime. Tabak's defense clung to the claim of manslaughter, arguing that while he was guilty of killing Joanna, he had not intended to murder her. He tried to portray himself as socially awkward, unable to navigate interactions with women, and overwhelmed in the heat of the moment. But the jury was not convinced. They saw the evidence as overwhelming. His lies, his attempts at concealment, and his disturbing online activities. Strangulation, the judge reminded the court, requires sustained pressure lasting several minutes. This was not an instant loss of control, it was murder. As the trial unfolded, more painful details surfaced. Joanna had likely been lured into a conversation by Tabak, perhaps trusting him as a neighbor. In her final moments, she would have experienced fear and resistance, her life taken from her by someone she scarcely knew. For her family, every revelation was a wound reopened, a reminder of the brutality she endured. Greg Reardon sat through the proceedings, forced to relive the nightmare of losing the woman he loved. His grief was quiet but visible, the courtroom bearing witness to the devastation Tabak had caused. In October 2011, after careful deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Vincent Tabak was guilty of the murder of Joanna Yates. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. For Joanna's parents, David and Teresa, the conviction brought a measure of justice, though it could never bring back their daughter. They spoke publicly afterward, expressing gratitude to the police and the community, but also the deep sorrow of parents whose child had been stolen from them. The aftermath of the case stretched beyond the conviction. Questions were raised about how the media had handled the investigation, particularly the wrongful vilification of Christopher Jeffries. Newspapers had painted him as a monster without evidence, a move that would later cost them dearly in court. Jeffries, though eventually vindicated, had endured weeks of humiliation and suspicion that forever altered his life. His case became a turning point in discussions about press ethics and the responsibility of journalism during high-profile investigations. For the people of Bristol, the murder of Joanna Yates left an indelible mark. What began as the disappearance of a young woman at Christmas had become a national tragedy, a cautionary tale about both the fragility of life and the dangers of rushing to judgment. The story was far from over, for the impact of the case would continue to ripple long after the trial ended, shaping public debate, legal precedents, and the memories of those who had known and loved Joanna. The conviction of Vincent Tabak in October 2011 brought an end to one of the most harrowing murder trials in recent British history, but it did not silence the questions. nor did it heal the wounds left behind. For the family of Joanna Yates, justice in the courtroom could never translate into restoration. A daughter, vibrant and full of promise, was gone forever. Her parents, David and Teresa, emerged into the public eye not as ordinary parents, but as symbols of dignity in the face of unimaginable loss. They spoke of their daughter with unshakable pride, recalling her kindness, her energy, and the plans she had for her future. Yet beneath every word lingered the unspoken truth. Nothing could undo the crime that had shattered their world. Greg Reardon, Joanna's boyfriend, also faced a long road of grief. To him, she was not simply a victim in a headline but the woman with whom he had built a life. He had lived in the flat where she had taken her last steps, and he was the one who had first sounded the alarm when she vanished. The memory of those frantic days, checking her phone, calling her friends, retracing her steps, would stay with him forever. In court, he listened quietly, rarely speaking, but his presence was a reminder that behind the public case lay a private love story that had ended in tragedy. The wider community of Clifton and Bristol struggled too. The case had dominated daily life for months, and in many ways the neighborhood would never feel the same again. Residents who had once felt secure now lived with the shadow of fear. The idea that a young woman could be murdered by the man next door was chilling, eroding a sense of safety in even the most familiar spaces. The tragedy resonated far beyond Bristol, sparking conversations across the country about safety, about trust, and about how well we really know those who live closest to us. The case also forced an uncomfortable reckoning with the media. Christopher Jeffries, once an eccentric landlord known only to his tenants and a few colleagues from his teaching career, had been thrust into the spotlight in the most damaging way possible. Tabloid newspapers had splashed his face across their front pages, speculating wildly about his character and portraying him as a predator. Words like weird, strange, and oddball became shorthand for guilt in the public eye. Yet he had done nothing wrong. His arrest had been based on suspicion, and when the police released him, the media offered little in the way of retraction. It took legal action for Jeffries to clear his name fully, eventually winning libel damages from several publications. But the ordeal left scars. His case became a symbol of the dangers of trial by media, leading to debates in Parliament and changes in how the press handled reporting on criminal investigations. For Jeffries, life would never return to what it had been before December 2010. Meanwhile, Vincent Tabak began his life sentence. To the world outside, he was the murderer of Joanna Yates, a man whose disturbing interest in violent pornography had spilled into reality. But within prison walls, he became another inmate serving time, one among many men whose crimes had brought them to the same fate. His girlfriend, Tanya Morrison, had to face the devastating realization that the man she thought she knew was capable of monstrous violence. She withdrew from public view, left to reconcile the betrayal and horror privately. Even after the trial, speculation lingered about Tabak's motive. Why had he killed Joanna? Some believed it was a crime driven by sexual frustration, pointing to his internet searches and the sexual undertones of his browsing history. Others suggested jealousy or resentment, perhaps a twisted attraction to Joanna that turned deadly when she rejected him. Tabak himself never provided a clear explanation, insisting to the end that her death had not been premeditated. For the Yates family, this lack of clarity was a wound that never healed. They had answers about who killed their daughter, but not why. The case continued to resonate in broader conversations about the criminal justice system. It underscored the importance of forensic evidence, without which Tabak might have evaded justice. The fibers, the phone records, the inconsistencies in his story, all of these were the building blocks that exposed him. But it also highlighted the fallibility of investigations under public pressure. The arrest of Jeffries showed how easily suspicion could turn into condemnation, and how damaging missteps could be when amplified by a hungry press. For Joanna's parents, the years after the trial were marked by advocacy as well as grief. They spoke openly about their daughter, ensuring that her memory was not defined solely by her death. They called for greater sensitivity in the media and better protection for individuals wrongly accused. Their composure in public, even while mourning, won respect across the nation. In every interview, in every statement, they reminded the world that behind the headlines and legal arguments, this was about a daughter whose life had been stolen. As time passed, the murder of Joanna Yates became part of the collective memory of true crime in the UK. It was studied by criminologists, dissected in documentaries, and remembered as a case that exposed both the darkest corners of human behavior and the flaws in societal systems. For those who lived through it in Bristol, however, it was not merely a case. It was a personal wound, one that transformed their community and their sense of trust. The final image of Joanna, captured on CCTV as she purchased a pizza on that cold December night, remains haunting. It is the ordinary quality of that image that makes it unforgettable. She was not in a dangerous place, nor engaged in risky behavior. She was simply going home. That truth underlines the chilling randomness of what happened to her. It is what makes her story linger. The reminder that tragedy can strike in the most mundane of moments, and that sometimes the threat is not distant but alarmingly close. In reflecting on Joanna's case, one cannot separate the tragedy from its wider implications. It is the story of a young woman whose future was stolen, of a family forced to endure the unendurable, of a community shaken to its core. It is also the story of a man wrongly accused and vilified, and of another man whose hidden darkness erupted into lethal violence. It is a story about grief, justice, and the search for meaning in the aftermath of senseless crime. As the years move forward, anniversaries of Joanna's death bring quiet memorials. Flowers are laid, tributes are shared, and her name is spoken by those who loved her. In these moments, the focus shifts away from her killer and back to the woman she was: bright, kind, ambitious, and deeply loved. That is the memory her family has fought to preserve, even as the world remembers the crime. The murder of Joanna Yates was not just an isolated act of violence. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting its strengths and its failings. It showed the tenacity of detectives determined to find the truth, the resilience of a family devastated by loss, and the dangers of a media too quick to condemn. In the end, it became more than the story of a crime. It became a story about justice, about responsibility, and about the enduring impact of one young woman whose life mattered.